we have chosen the theme of emerging or re-emerging fascisms and digitalities because we're asking if the changes of the nation state in neoliberal capitalism and digital times on the one hand, and the current conjuncture of racism, right-wing nationalism, and authoritarianism on the other, if this relation demands an update of our understanding of the relation of race, class, and nation. And then I don't mean in a sort of way of inventing the wheel, like Brenna has highlighted, but rather there are current political obstacles. And sometimes we have to think with what is there to rethink where to go. So it's in this genealogical relation. So yeah, this is our last slot, and we're very happy to have Brenna, Bhandar, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Nishant, Shah, Françoise Vergès, and Mark Graham here for this discussion.
So it's a pleasure to have you back for this sort of closing session that is supposed to bring everything together. Right? There are lots of threads lying loose on the table, on the floor, in and among the chairs, and so on. So I'm just going to put some thoughts out there to try and keep some of these threads alive. And starting with the question of futurisms. I mean, the re-emergence of fascisms is about a present and a future, and a conception or an enclosed, the enclosure act of a future, right? An attempt to close some things down. Obviously having a great deal to do with the question that has come up over the past, certainly since yesterday with Mark Graham's presentation and Etienne's response. And my question around the intellectualization of labor, its racial, gendered, national configurations, and indeed reconfigurations of class through the digital, that, as Etienne's remark in response yesterday sort of indicated, have anthropological and sort of elements to it. Right? And so there's a question around the role of the digital in relation to the political, the reframing of the political, the proliferation of discourses of competing and clashing kinds in and through the digital, but also the reframing of labor as a consequence of the digital that we heard yesterday, and Nishant has obviously done a good deal of work on as well. Alongside of this, I want just to pull on the thread that has emerged in bits and pieces. I mean, there was obviously Nilofer Ghalay's talk last night around the religious, but just to think about the religious, and then a comment earlier on the day before, to think about the kind of long historical trajectory of the religious in relation to the racial, right? There's a sense in which, I mean, I started the opening session with some remarks where Françoise and I were talking, some remarks around the way in which Europe conceived of itself in modern terms from the 1450s onwards, exactly in terms of excluding constitutive others that were religiously marked, in a sense, as the emergence of race, right? So the constitutive exclusions were Jews, Moors, Muslims, blacks regarded as heathen, American Indians regarded as heathen, and so on. So you can see the way in which the religious and the racial, from the very outset, come into a kind of articulation with each other. And there's a way in which I want to suggest, sort of drawing on earlier work of my own, is that the racial, in exactly these historical terms, is the secularization of the religious, right, and the theological. That is what the religious brought in terms of origin story, in terms of kinship structure, in terms of who belongs and who doesn't, and so on and so forth. Increasingly, as modernity took hold, sort of over centuries, of course, that increasingly the racial came to occupy a good deal of the work, not all of the work, obviously, but a good deal of the work that the religious had sort of provided, which then complexifies the role of the religious today, both in terms of possibility and in terms of closing down. And then that raises the question that was raised in the previous couple of panels around warring and civil warring, sort of civil antagonisms, reaching a condition of war, and the question that has been raised repeatedly since yesterday: who the enemy? Is there only one enemy? Is there only one we? Right, and that then, of course, raises the notion of publics that Kelly put on the table yesterday. The possibility of publics. Where are the publics? Who are the publics? And can there be a being in common, in relation to those publics, when the public itself or publics themselves are so fraught, right? Not least digital publics, right? Themselves are there and they're not there. Come, disappear, appear, disappear. Disappear in the sense that they might not go away, but appear elsewhere in other form. So these are very complex circulations. And then two final points. One is dread as the impolitics of our time. The sense that dread is different than fear. Fear has a defined object. Dread doesn't really have a defined object. We wake up each morning dreading what it is that we're facing. What disaster is coming next, and that differs in class terms, it differs in racial terms, is articulated differently in different ways. It proliferates anxieties. Those anxieties express themselves in different ways. It proliferates, as people have been commenting, suspicion of others, who's my friend, who's not, how is friendship. And it's I say an impolitic because it's a really, dread is a deep, a delimitation of the political, if not a deep politicizing, right? How is one political in the face of dread, right? And I think here, one can think of many examples. Those who know me well will know where I'm coming from. But Afro-pessimism is a form of dread, and the politics it has is maybe an impolitic in exactly this kind of sense. What is the form of movement that comes out of the Afro-pessimistic, in some sense? Which is not to say that there need only be one Afro-pessimism, right? And then finally, sort of as a challenge, how to think about the kind of politics emerging, proliferating again in different places. We saw some of it in the video about India in the first session, around youth politics, right? And what are the possibilities that it produces? What are its enablements? What are its disablements? How to support it? Does it need support from those of us who are not sort of part of that generation? Given that the generation I'm of has so screwed it up, right? Sort of repeatedly, so a complex set of possibilities about the future and futurisms in that kind of way. And so we have again a number of images that, can you screen please? So this speaks to the question that was asked in the earlier session. We had it before you asked the question about Génération Identitaire and their manifesto of a declaration of war, exactly. And next.
David, we have 20 minutes.
Yeah, we can go.
Okay.
We can go. Go to part one if we need to. Manuela said not to worry about the time.
Okay. I don't want to go first.
No, you don't have to go.
Thank you.
Itself.
Okay, we don't have to. Okay.
Okay. Anybody want to comment? Yeah, go, Nishant.
I can kick off with something very strange that we've been observing lately. So I work with a group of young people who refuse to be called young anyway, but they're between the ages of 12 and 16, and they think they're very old and wise. And we've been doing a whole range of tracking of two very strange things that are happening in India, where there is actually a case study unfolding about an emergence of a more authoritarian regime than we are used to, right? That on the one hand, when it comes to digital spaces, we have never had so many platforms to voice protest. From platforms like Avaz, from platforms like petitions, which even Facebook allows you to make, from this amplification of so many protest cultures kind of developing to make your voice heard and fight against certain kinds of power structures. At the same time, in the generation that I have lived through, but also the younger people that I work with, we have never seen such extreme persecution of protest when it is being initiated by youth cultures. Be it within academic spaces like the List, be it in like real hardcore on-the-ground demonstrations against different kinds of rights. One of the things that's really coming up very interestingly is that fascism or authoritarian regimes are no longer a direct black and white conflict where they do not allow for protest. In fact, the new form of digital authoritarianism is where there is a gentrification and a Disneyfication of protest cultures. That there is a specific kind of freedom that you are allowed to articulate, and there's a specific way in which to articulate. So last year what we did was we picked up a set of common fights that these young people believe in, and they made two different sets of profiles. So every time, and they put it out as petitions on Avaz and Facebook and so on. Every time they articulated something as a freedom of, right? So it's a freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of survival. You had like thousands of people liking it, voting for it, celebrating it, and so on, because it's very easy to think about this future freedom that we are going to achieve, and we are all together in it. The same protest when it was voiced as freedom from patriarchy, from nation states, from military occupation, and so on, got nothing. Right? And this is a specific form of fascism now, because it means that it will keep on giving you a certain framework under which you can keep on hoping for almost like a cruelly optimistic form of the future, and that is going to be allowed to you. But at the same time, anything that is confrontational and kind of questions the very power that kind of structures that freedom is something that's going to be penalized on the extreme. And I wanted to put that on the table, because it's not just yes, free speech, no free speech, my free speech, your free speech, and so on. And it's not even a very clean censorship of free speech anymore. But that the very structures through which these kinds of protests can be articulated have now been set into place. And I call them the Disneyfication of protest cultures. Right? So it's always a freedom for, and there is always a utopia at the end of it, which is a happy kind of unicorns pooping rainbows, memes produced about fascist cultures and so on, so that your incredibly right-wing authoritarian prime minister could be giving horrifying speeches in which are complicit to lynch mobs killing Muslims on public spaces. And there is this particular photo of him where he's doing this, and that context has been kind of stripped off it, and basically it says, all the people in the room raise your hands, right? And that becomes the meme. And that then travels further and becomes kind of decontextualized. So this specific form by which fascism is no longer a direct confrontation, but kind of Disneyfied through digital channels is something that I wanted to just throw onto the table.
What did you...
Well, what I find interesting is you know, this Disneyfication of through platforms or through digital media. What's interesting is that we're, you know, if we see our contemporary moment as allowing these sorts of things. What's interesting about this year, 2018, is this is the first time in human history where we have more people connected to the internet than not connected to the internet. And if we take these visions that we used to have about what the digital would allow us to do, you know, it would bring us together in a global village. It would allow us to step beyond some of the bodily meat space differences that we all have. It's fascinating that we seem to have totally jettisoned this idea of what the internet can afford and what it can allow at this moment in which the majority of humanity has now come together on the internet. That there are, in the context that I was talking about yesterday, in digital labor, this planetary labor market where we have about 70 million people looking for jobs in these online markets, and you see all this, essentially this race to the bottom, people competing against each other, no solidarities, all these potentials for antagonisms and fractures. So I think what we don't have good answers for yet are where are the actual moments here for resistance? So what can you actually do? How do you build bridges together? How do you build alliances? How do you enact solidarities with one another when faced with competition and no collaboration at this sort of global planetary scale?
Yeah, it's more what, you know, going back to what Veronica or Kelly or Raquel raised and what you talk about, you know, who is the enemy. I was wondering how should we think death and murder, the political death and murder, not really around the question of visibility and visibility representation, but the way in which it had been associated with colonial policies and it has changed now. It's not really, you know, us and them and us. So how should we see, I mean, and the fact also that for a lot of people around the world who thought that they would be protected from death and murder, either by belonging to a country which is at peace or to a class, a social class, which is protected, this is being weakening. So how could we think of this, you know, and the relation then with fascism and feeling of you know, like we have to protect our own. So and so death and murder in that, and we recall, you know, the Brazilian woman Maria Franco. So that was one point. The second point also, I thought about, you know, should we talk about the fact that exporting fascism no longer through the same, you know, way it was in the 30s, as through religion and culture. I'm just thinking from my part of the world, you know, Indian Ocean, the way in which the BJP is bringing, you know, idea about what is Hinduism and what is to be a good Hindu in Mauritius, Réunion, Madagascar, and everywhere, and therefore anti-Muslim. And it's not the product of colonial time, it's a product of really contemporary politics, inviting people, you know, to go pure, whatever, or the way in which Saudi Arabia also export a certain idea of what is to be a Muslim, and that we see also going on through the Comoro Islands. So not really just a north-south divide, but how it's different circulation. I would like us to think about that. And my last point also, it's connected with the question of futurism and thinking. I was thinking, because it was part of something I thought about so many years ago. It's how do we think defeat, the question of defeat. First, during my adolescence, my parents were activists, and every election they were defeated because there was fraud, and the French state was sending the police. And every time it arrived, we were like, so why to fight? And my father said, okay, tomorrow we start to reorganize. I was like, oh God. So that was, and then the second thing, like very quickly, I work for, the project of museum in Réunion Island for 10 years. With a fantastic team. We brought young people from the island. It was fantastic. And it was killed by the conservative, by the French state. And I remember after it was killed and everything was disappeared, all the archives were erased and so on, I read an interview of Eric Hobsbawm. And he said, all my life I've been trustful to an idea, communism, which has been defeated. But, I'm paraphrasing, but defeat sharpened the mind. And victory make you complacent. And I was like, it's not sharpening my mind at all. I'm totally depressed, I'm absolutely depressed. And then I understood what he meant. And because when I was able to sharpen my mind, I was able to understand the reason for defeat. The fact that why these people were so much against it. And not that they were mean, and in the end they don't like me, whatever. And it allowed me to transform defeat as another moment in the long struggle. So it was not experiencing as depression, but okay, well, we have to fight. They're not gonna, let us enter like that. Oh, please come to the table and share the meal with us. Stay in the back. So that also, I will, towards also what young people think. And really, the last point I would like to also to share is that with a lot of young activists sometime in France or in Africa, they don't want really to know about the past. And of course, the first reaction is like, oh, well, we did that in the 60s. We were good too, right? We did. And I've been trying to look at it positively, that they don't want to know, and how this could be also look, for thinking the future positively. And so we look at their dream and not at their aspiration, as Dimitri was explaining to us, like a young woman told her, you had dreams, we have aspiration. and so to revert that. Okay, so that's just 2 or 3 things I wanted to.
Thank you. Okay, so I actually just want to ask 3 questions. So I just want to take advantage of the scene to ask things that I'm curious about. I don't have any answers to at all. The first question is really to Nishant and Maya and Mark also and others about how you see the relationship between the use of social media and online platforms, the relationship between that and then actual political activity on the ground. So what is the relationship between the, yes, well, just what I stated. I have a long-standing now and kind of deep suspicion about the effects and utility of using social media, particularly when they are profit-generating corporate platforms, for using those platforms for the dissemination of, information, the dissemination of critique, for mobilizing demonstrations, all of these kinds of things that then become data that's captured by Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, as many people have pointed out, it's social media, and in the eyes of some, that have really allowed us to form more kinds of different solidarities that we wouldn't be able to, at least in the time frames that using online platforms allow. But for those of us who have, from time to time, been involved in political organizing on the ground, we know that it is, kind of really hard, unglamorous, back-breaking kind of work that does not generate attention in the way that the stuff we see on online platforms does. So, which that leads to my suspicion about its effects and its. Okay, so that's the first question. The second question goes back to the conversation about free speech, which is really it's really. I think, fruitful to have this conversation with people from so many different places, because the specificities of how the contestations over free speech are manifesting in all of these different places, I think is really important. And my question is, how do we redefine the terrain away from framing it as an issue of free speech, which is, a part of what we're trying to do in the UK, where unlike the US context where it becomes a big debate about the First Amendment and you get involved in constitutional interpretation issues, etc., in the UK, it's the limits on free speech have really been aimed at pro-Palestine events and whether they're academic conferences or whether they're political events, etc. And in my particular location at SOAS, we've had several times now the disruption of events organized by the Center for Palestine Studies. So these are events that are open to the public. They're not just strictly academic events, but they've been disrupted by pro-Zionist activists. Sometimes in ways that involve a lot of harassment, and we have been told by the university administration that we have to pay for more security. So when it's the this is now of course being appealed, but when it comes to the pro-Palestine activities, it becomes not a question of free speech, but we are told it's a security issue. We know this is an issue of racism, so we are trying to not answer back by saying this is violating our free speech, but pointing out that this is deeply politically problematic and indeed racist. So I just wanted to ask the question about how can we respond back to the limits on free speech by bringing in, the rest of the terrain that I think gets left out when we just see it as an issue of free speech, perhaps. And then the third question has to do with Niloufer's talk last night. And I want to ask a question kind of going back to the themes of feminism and thinking about the rise of authoritarian regimes, which are often identified with a particular religious or racial religious right-wing ideology. I want to ask how we can, if anyone is interested in thinking about a kind of reconstructed secular feminist project, or is there space for that conversation where dealing with religious difference from a feminist perspective doesn't necessarily mean just throwing, I feel shy to say it, but just throwing secularism out of the window. So I guess I just want to ask, we've kind of gotten to the point where we know that feminists, anti-racists need to understand and in a way embrace the practices, which, as we know from the work of Saba Mahmood, are not just, religious practices as we perceive them within a, Judeo-Christian framework. So we've gotten that far, but then what is the next step? Where do we go from here in the face of rising authoritarian regimes that are punishing women and trans communities in very particular ways based on religious ideology? So those are my questions.
Those are great, so I don't have to say anything. We can go. I want to thank again the organizers and David and Françoise for including me in this very provocative series of conversations. And I hope I have been antagonistic, and I intend to continue being so. But I want to raise the question, picking up from where Brenna left off, about how we might think about antagonism in the context of, you know, the current conjunctures of racism, the rise of neo-fascism, and even not neo-fascism, you know, what is to be done. So some observations. First is that if we're going to talk about the future at all, then we are theorizing, because all theory is a guide for the future. It's a guide for action. That's all it is. It's all it is ever for anyone, including when anybody gets out of bed in the morning. They have a theory about what's going to happen if they go in the kitchen and flip the switch. The light will come on, right? And so theory and practice are intimately connected. They shape each other. We know this, but I think it has to be repeated today because there was a little bit of frisson the other night after Etienne gave his intensive talk. So then, in thinking about what is happening today, I want to return to a term that Brenna used yesterday in her questioning of and unease with some of the things that Kaushik had said. And she used the word partition. And partition is a centrally operating, organizing principle of all of modernity, all of it. And indeed, it typifies modernity. The partition and repartition of geographies is what brings us together here today. And when I say geographies, I don't mean the flattening image that you have of space on the map. I mean the social, political, cultural, racial, ethnic, religious lives that people live throughout the planet's surface and in between the places that are covered with earth and dirt by the oceans, such as the Indian Ocean. And so as the organization of space throughout modernity endures partition after partition, we can ask ourselves, in fact, we're compelled to ask ourselves questions about war, about belonging, about imperialism, and about the nation state, something that we have obsessed about here over the last few days. But it also means that we must ask ourselves about scale and the politics of scale. And I'm indebted to my late supervisor, Neil Smith, for thinking the spatial through the politics of scale, and in particular, thinking about the organization of capitalist space and how it has changed over time. How it has changed over time. So, for example, Tony invoked the other day how the kind of site of production seems to be more and more intensively the urban, wherever we look on the Earth's surface, whereas it used to be something more complex in terms of a region because the costs and frictions of transportation and so forth required certain kinds of contiguity of raw and finished products before they're sent out into the world. Those, because of innovations in transportation as well as communication, those imperatives have changed, and so has, again, the partition of the world, the capitalist organization of space. And we experience all of this at the most intimate scale, which is the scale of the body. But having thought, as we much think, the centrality of the scale of the body, we are, I think, mistaken if we confuse that we are each one, with a kind of individualizing understanding of things like racism, right? That even though we've been talking a lot about structures over the last few days, the way racism keeps on appearing, and sexism and gender discrimination as well, seems to be about individuals, right? It seems to be about individuals, and individuals having bad feelings or bad ideas or bad thoughts or incomplete knowledge, rather than thinking about structures in the in the dynamic way that we ought to, which is to say thinking about structures as having internal logics and performing transformation, whether the structure is the institution of the university, the institution of this 3-day symposium, the household, and so forth. So that said, I want to say 2 more things, and then I will rest. In the current conjuncture, as homogenization and differentiation do their ongoing work, we see that contradiction, which is to say co-constitutive interdependencies, become in many, 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 many situations more antagonistic. And I think an error, an analytical and political error that many of us make is to think that either contradiction should not be antagonistic or can only be antagonistic, rather than understanding that the dynamic of human life is difference and therefore contradiction. And so we can focus on the antagonisms and otherwise figure out ways provisionally to resolve other contradictions in terms of radical dependency. Right? And the contradiction that matters to me, and this goes to what Raquel was talking about, is premature death, which is to say war-making. Whether the enemy is domestic or foreign or moving across borders makes no difference. And abolition, the principles that I talked about the other day, attends to fatality. Right? It's not about homogenizing, it's about understanding the dynamics of homogenization and differentiation when at the edges, over and over and over again, fatality is the experience that people have. So we're thinking then about organized abandonment and organized violence and how racism justifies both of those forces, and I've written a lot about this. You can read about it in Policing the Planet. And also devolution. And you know, there's an institute that was founded by the child of people who fled the Nazis to the United States, the Bergeron family, very wealthy, settled in the Bay Area. Their child, who is an adult, who brags about being a citizen of no place because he's so rich he can be any place, he started an institute to study how the world should be governed. And Craig Calhoun, I believe, is the president of it now, and it's got its headquarters in Los Angeles. And if you go on the Bergeron Institute website and read some of the so-called white papers, you will find that there is a whole lot of work coming out of neoliberalism, not neo-fascism, that is organized around trying to think and put into practice an organization of capitalist space on a world scale, such that people at the more local will think they're involved in some kind of democratic life, and people who are running the world's system will be selected by others of their peers, right, to rule. Now, Craig Calhoun's a good guy. This is what this institute is trying to understand. And they roll out pilot projects in places like California to try to test it. So this is the world in which I think we're living, and I think the antagonisms are very clear for us to confront, rather than beating the dead horse of, say, a failed communist party, when we have Marxist principles and other principles that we can use to get from where we are to where we need to go.
Thank you.
Craig, just as an afterthought to that, said it's really tough working for a billionaire. and is likely not to last much longer as a consequence.
Wasn't personal about Craig. It's not about him. It's about the thing.
Thank you. We're going to open it up for discussion with the audience now. I have to say that we're going to be very strict now with the questions, and please also with the time, because time is running, and we do not want to take the space for the next discussion. Etienne, you were on the list since the last slot. And then we'll have two more remarks, and then wrap it up, maybe.
Intent on reacting to the question of the politics of friendship, and I wanted to say something about the category struggle. But now we are on a different subject. This being said, I would very much like to say something on this new, if you allow me. Yeah? So I'm no longer on the list. I'm just asking.
I mean, it refers to struggle also, I think, what Ruth
but
just
I
said.
want to react to what Brenna has, the question that she has raised,
Yeah.
if you allow me. And by the same token, I want to try and compensate for a certain frustration that I have, and I believe I'm not the only one, because of the fact that there was very little discussion actually after Niloufer's presentation yesterday night, and you referred to that. I think it's the same subject, so let's not... I'll express my own position. I can't do otherwise. Not only I would agree with you, Brenna, if this is your position, that a principled standpoint on these very complex issues where religion returns, or something called religion, or a reference to religion returns very violently. There's no such thing as the absolute return of the religious, because it never disappeared. It was always an essential part of our social life and power structures. But it's returning in new forms, and it becomes combined and so to speak, melted, I would say, with nationalism, racism. The boundaries, the very boundaries between these categories are increasingly fuzzy. At some point, it's important to identify the components, but at some point, the search for a single category that would help us precisely identify the enemy or define the strategy is absurd, because what we have to do is precisely a combination of all that. And the question of Islamophobia in Europe, for example, but perhaps, although I'm aware this is a completely different history, in Southeast Asia is a perfect example of that. So my position, so Ranabia said yesterday, I don't like the notion of the global left. Okay. I prefer to keep the notion of internationalist left, therefore internationalism. So I will say that on these matters, I bring back, or I stick to a third term. They are close to one another, but there are interesting nuances, which is cosmopolitanism. So I think that we need a cosmopolitan point of view, even in the etymological sense of the term. That is a point of view that is the point of view of a politics that thinks of itself and tries to organize, say, or become conscious and implemented of itself at the level of the cosmopolis. Now, the position that I defended some time ago in a book that is now coming out soon in English with compliments is that we have a double mind. Such a cosmopolitan perspective cannot not be secular. But then the kind of secularism that we have today, and particularly the kind of secularism that is officialized in some countries, some more than others. Of course, the French case, where secularism is called laïcité, is perhaps an extreme case. Some years ago, I was in India. I was interviewed by a journal. They trapped me somehow. So to my surprise, the interview was published with the title, Balibar declares in France, laïcité has become another religion. So I thought, oh my God, that's... But okay, there is clearly something extreme, I would say, in the case of French laïcité, or one tendency in French laïcité that makes it, and I borrow the category intentionally from a great German anthropologist and Egyptologist, eine Gegenreligion, a counter religion. So that leads me to my point, and I finish with that, which is that the point of view or the general umbrella, problematic, if you like, within which we can try and clarify these issues cannot be religious. It has to be secular, provided secularism itself becomes severely, I would say, and radically transformed and self-criticized. Now, if you allow me just two last remarks on that. First, the question of the official secularism is a question of intense struggle and conflict and dissensus in each and every of our countries, especially in Europe in this moment. Yesterday, Niloufer quoted, and that I was surprised that nobody would take up the discussion in the issue, because we are in Germany after all here, even if it is Haus der Kultur in der So she mentioned the fact that the the newly appointed German Minister of the Interior has declared that Islam does not belong to Germany. And this morning you open the newspaper and you read on front page, Merkel widerspricht Seehofer, auch der Islam gehört zu Deutschland. Islam is also part of Germany. So the conflict is everywhere in a specific form. And it's absolutely vital, I think, to, I would say negotiate, but to take sides and to find a strategy in this respect. Final thing, the question of women and the sexism, etc., is of course the center, and it's instrumentalized, as you described, in the most dangerous manner by fascist tendencies. Génération identitaire. And identitaire is a key word, because in France, the type of offensive and aggressive defense of laïcité that we have is best called an identitarian form of laïcité. But this is not only small fascist groups. These are ministers. These are political parties. So this question is crucial. Now, my conviction, I'm sorry to speak always in the first person, but my conviction is the structures of sexist oppression and patriarchy, and the structures of racist post-colonial or neo-colonial dominations are, of course, permanently interwoven, and intersectionality is all about the combined effect of these two. This being said, if the enemy, so to speak, or the obstacle that you have to face, the kind of post-colonial Islamophobic racism, this will not, by some miracle, neutralize or suppress the elements of patriarchic oppression that exist in the migrant or communities. Therefore, I tried to describe the situation, and here I have a relatively strong disagreement with Joan Scott, even if I admire her work. I said that the young girls and women in the French banlieue, they are in fact caught in the middle of two phallocratic, patriarchic regimes of different tradition, of course, one of which tries to impose the veil, and one of which tries to tear it off. So their position is the most difficult of all. Yeah. And this is the reason why I so much admire the young Muslim, or they call themselves like that, okay, women who right now in France explain, we are Afro-feminist, we are anti-colonial feminists. We identify Islamophobia as the main danger and enemy. But for that reason, we're not going to join a kind of communitarian defense of some famous Islamic theologian who is now accused of being a rapist. This is true or not, we'll see. But we take this question very seriously as well. And of course, they are under fire from all sides.
Thank you. We're really running out of time. I'm so sorry. We have to have one more question or remark before here the panelists can maybe give rather 2 cents. It's not even a response, but if there's one more question out of the audience.
Okay. I got
if you can
question.
keep it really short.
Yeah, very short. So this session is about the fascism, returns in digital time something. So listening to the one you talk about, actually fascism, I think the term as such is one of political, or some whatever actually term abused by many people. That means sometimes liberalists actually use that fascism as an insulting word or swear word to attack, the other right-wing side something. But we need actually, in my opinion, actually we need narrow down the use of the term fascism. Actually, I think the fascism got historical origin. It's not just in a general right-wing, thought. It's a kind of ideology which wanna definitely reproduce actually the people, by their own intention. What kind of intention? In my opinion, actually very connected to the capitalism. So in my opinion, fascism is actually rooted in that kind of angst, from the below. Those who believe that actually capitalism does not work very well. We need actually the removed enemy, or kind of creating the enemy, within actually the border or territory in the nation state something, and we should get back to the pure nation something. So my question is, if you said actually that the fascism returns in digital times something, and how actually that kind of actually fascism could persuade people actually through this kind of technological, actual development, advancement, and how does it return, at the moment?
Thank you.
Just one thing, because the woman thing is coming back since the beginning, and I would like again to say that it's not the woman question. I know that this is not what you are saying at all, but it's how we're going to rethink race, class, and nation without not putting gender as something that's going to transform it and that we have to add, but that's going to totally transform the way we think about race, class, and nation. This is really clear. And the question of feminism that you raise, I think, is very important. And this can be discussed also in France, for instance. Every summer, you have the bikini-burkini controversy, okay? So every summer, you can prepare yourself. You're going to have the bikini-burkini situation. But what was interesting, and it go back to what you say, is last summer, in the meantime, you had women demonstration in the Rif in Morocco, supporting the social movement in Morocco. This was not discussed. So I will say that our solidarity will be with this woman demonstrating in the Rif and get out of the burkini controversy, which is absolutely worthless. So that will be the beginning of answer.